Alrighty, folks, thanks for coming out on day 2 of the Montana Book Festival. Today, I have Jennifer Chesak. Chesak, excellent, is the author of the Psilocybin Handbook for Women. She's an award-winning freelance science and medical journalist, editor, and fact-checker, and her work has appeared in several national publications, including the Washington Post. Chesak earned her Master's of Science in Journalism from Northwestern University's Medal. She currently teaches in the journalism and publishing programs at Belmont University. Well, thank you so much, Jennifer.
Thank you for having me. What a cool festival.
Yeah. So, if you haven't read the book yet, it has a bunch of stories of people and their interactions with psilocybin, but it also is kind of set up like a question and answer.
Yeah, absolutely. I really wanted to create it in a format that, you wouldn't necessarily have to read it cover to cover if you were busy and you just wanted the information that you wanted right then that applies to you. So I did kind of a choose your own adventure style where you can look at the table of contents, find the information that you're interested in, go to that section, and then if you need more information about something else, there are prompts throughout the chapters on where to find things next.
Yeah, so I think we want to ask the first big question of the book. What do women need to know about psilocybin and why is it different for them?
Yeah, a great question. It's a common question that I get is, why did I write a book for women? And I'm like, well, why not? But to talk a little bit about the state of women's health will kind of help illustrate why I chose to really focus on women's health. And so just to dive into that a little bit, women actually report more use of some psychedelics than men do. And at first I was kind of surprised when I learned that, but then when I dug a little deeper, I learned that while men typically use psilocybin for more recreational purposes, not all men, women tend to use psychedelics to self-treat conditions. So that could be PTSD, depression, anxiety, but also chronic pain conditions and other things like that. And why does it not surprise me that women use psychedelics to self-treat? It's because it seems like, in many cases, the mainstream medical community has really left women's health as sort of, they put it on the back burner as the last thing to be looked at. And of course, right now we have all this emerging science and research coming out about psilocybin right now and other psychedelics as well for treating some of these conditions. And so I really wanted to create this book for women to focus on women's health because, again, it gets left on the back burner. And to kind of illustrate what I mean by that, so women were largely excluded from early stage clinical trials, not just in the psychedelic space, but everywhere, until the 1990s. So women were not involved in drug clinical trials for the most part. And that has had lasting ramifications for women's health. And I'd like to throw out this timeline to sort of get you fired up about it, because this illustrates how far behind we are in women's health. So in 1998, men got a drug for male sexual dysfunction. We all know what that is. Can anyone shout it out? You got it. Okay, you all, it's a household name, right? At that point in time, we didn't even have a complete picture of what the clitoris looks like. So there's all this internal structure to the clitoris. And that wasn't discovered until 2005. So the medical community didn't know about it, let alone any person that a woman was sleeping with. They didn't know how to find the clitoris, essentially, because it has all this internal structure. So again, that happened in 2005 when a female urologist did some MRI research and discovered this and then presented literature on it. Now, fast forward to 2015, that is when women finally got a drug for female sexual dysfunction. So we are looking at a 17-year gap from when men got a drug for a condition to when women got a drug for a condition. And I bet none of you actually know the name of that drug. We all know Viagra, but the other drug, the drug for female sexual dysfunction, is called ADE. And to further illustrate how far we are behind in women's health or how problematic this issue is for women, So looking at statistics of female sexual dysfunction, it's if you're in reproductive age, female sexual dysfunction, there's like a 40% prevalence of it, 45%. That increases so dramatically once women are going through like perimenopause and into menopause or after menopause, that elevates to 85% of women have some level of female sexual dysfunction. So that's alarming. But then I also want to talk about a condition that I have, which is endometriosis. And so 1 in 10 people assigned female at birth have endometriosis. In very rare cases, it can affect the male body as well. But so essentially, think about that. 10% of women across the globe have endometriosis. And the National Institutes of Health here in the US designated less than 0.1% of its research funding to this condition. Again, it's such a prevalent condition that affects women's health, and it affects every aspect of their lives, their work, their relationships, just their home life, their quality of life, everything, and yet it's not being studied. So again, then how do we tie psilocybin into this? Again, women are frustrated with not having good, adequate care in the mainstream medical system. So they're looking for other avenues, and psilocybin is certainly one of those avenues. And then we can touch on this a little bit later, because I know you're going to ask me a bunch of questions, but why would it be different for women? Well, of course, women have a menstrual cycle, and we have this hormone trajectory that occurs even if we are in menopause that's related to the menstrual cycle. And there is preliminary research that the estrogen affects the binding receptor sites of psilocybin when it binds to your serotonin receptors. Estrogen does something there, and it's possible that psilocybin affects the menstrual cycle, and it's possible that it matters where you are in the menstrual cycle when you choose to use psilocybin. So we can touch on that later, but I just wanted to give an overview about this concept of why are women turning to psilocybin, and what might be the differences there.
Yeah, so you talk about how women are using psilocybin more therapeutically. And there are a lot of different ways that people utilize it therapeutically. I think one that a lot of people will be familiar with is microdosing. But what are some others that are highlighted in the book?
Yeah, so what I did with chapter 11 was I took every condition that's out there that, I shouldn't say every, but a bunch of conditions where the conditions only affects the female body, affects women differently, or affects us disproportionately. And a way that a condition might affect women differently, an example would be smoking cessation. So that's not necessarily a condition, but if women are trying to quit smoking, it's different from the male body because the female and males have different nicotine receptors. And so when someone's trying to quit smoking, all of the products out there, like we think the patch, the Nicorette gum, all of that relies on the nicotine receptor. But women have such a different one that these products typically don't work for them. I shouldn't say never or anything like that, but it's harder for women to quit because of that. And psilocybin is being studied for smoking cessation. So if the condition is being studied in psilocybin in some way, or there was a parallel I could find, then I included those conditions in chapter 11. So the conditions that I included were PTSD and other traumas, anxiety, depression, but also things like premenstrual dysphoric disorder, which is PMDD for short, endometriosis. Let's see what else. Menopause. Not that menopause is not a condition, but people do have symptoms during menopause, and so I covered menopause in depth. Just the menstrual cycle in general, I covered that in depth in that chapter. Alcohol use disorder alcohol use disorder affects women differently, so I included that one. And then opioid use disorder as well, and then again, smoking cessation. There are a few more in there as well, I just can't remember them all off the top of my list. But and then just chronic pain in general, and menstrual migraine was another one that I included, which is something that I also have that's very related to endometriosis.
So I think that, got two questions here, so we'll just start with one. I think part of what's great about this book is it sort of positions psilocybin as not a cure-all, but something to try before more drastic situations. Like you bring up endometriosis. I just had a friend who, because of the lack of medical investment in that, her options basically went from suffer from it all the way to hysterectomy, with nothing in between. So, so when someone's curious about psilocybin as a way to address some of their struggles, like up here and in their body, how do you advise them to kind of start with trying to explore how it might help them?
Wow, that's a great question and a hard one to answer, because obviously access is a big issue. So, psilocybin is becoming legal in certain areas. So we've got like Oregon and Colorado have legislation involving psilocybin, and there's certain other areas of the U.S. I won't go through them all, but access is an issue. But I can talk a little bit about. So certainly you could go and find a psilocybin-assisted therapist or psychedelic-assisted therapist in one of the states where this has now become legal. There are also other possibilities. You can go to retreats in other countries where there's either legalization or decriminalization. So the use of psilocybin really isn't, prosecuted or anything. People are having retreats. There's also people out there that are considered to be underground guides, sort of working as shamans or curanderos, which is that's a Spanish word that means healer. I'm sorry that I don't pronounce it very well, but so there are options for you to find someone to help guide you through with a very therapeutic experience. And that's in talking about macro doses, and you also mentioned microdoses. So the difference there would be, just thinking about this in grams of psilocybin, a macro dose would be something like 3 grams, 3.5, even 2 grams is considered a macro dose. It's so when I talk about a macro dose, I mean that's the traditional concept of like you're tripping. You're going to have a trip where you have you see the visuals, you see vivid colors and things like that. And we can talk about the brain science of psilocybin, but just wanted to clarify between macro doses and microdoses. So a microdose then is going to be something like 1/10 of a gram, so a really tiny amount. And people do use microdosing regularly, and during a microdose you would not have those typical psychedelic effects, but you might have some beneficial effects, a lot like taking, I shouldn't say like, but similar how if you microdose, or if you take an SSRI, which is a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, if you're taking that for depression, you're taking that pretty regularly. With a microdose, people do different protocols where they might do 3 days a week they microdose, or 4 days a week. There are, again, different protocols that are out there that are solidified in the literature, but and I write about them in the book. But people microdose, again, to sort of stave off depression. But the literature shows that you can actually do 1 macrodose, and that can help with depression in a lasting way, where then you don't necessarily have to microdose. But a lot of people do choose to microdose to kind of continue their healing journey and process. Did that kind of answer your question about that?
Yeah, that was great. The next one is you have a ton of statistics, a ton of like actual research and good, like very like nitty gritty chemistry stuff in there, but you also have like anecdotes.
Yeah, I really wanted to incorporate people's experiences. So I interviewed 3 different women specifically about their own usage and journeys with psilocybin, and then I include my own journey with it as well. So I did a 3-day retreat with an underground guide who is a curandero or a healer, and he's an indigenous person. And so I incorporate that story of like, what was it like for me, and what did I learn from my experience? What sort of insights did I gain? How did it heal me in different ways? And then the 3 other women that I interviewed and incorporated their stories in individual chapters. One is a woman who was struggling with an eating disorder, and so she used psilocybin to sort of heal from that eating disorder. And there is science about this now. We've got good literature coming out about how psilocybin can help people with eating disorders. Specifically, the research is looking at anorexia nervosa right now. I think they're starting to look at binge eating disorder too. Researchers at different university hospitals that are studying psychedelics. Let's see, what else was I going to say about all of that? Then the other women, yeah, sorry, I lost my train of thought for a second there. The other women who I interviewed were, so again, the one that was healing from an eating disorder. There was another woman, she has ADHD, and some people do microdose for attention deficit hyperactive disorder, but she uses more of deeper journeys, so doing the macro dosing for her ADHD. And it's not necessarily to help with ADHD, it's to heal from trauma. This is what she was saying. It was to heal from trauma related to ADHD. So if you have ADHD, you're constantly operating at a different executive function level from other people. And when you live in a world where people expect you to be neurotypical and act a certain way and show up on time and plan ahead and be organized, that's really difficult for people with ADHD. And so there can be this trauma that is foisted upon them by society expecting them to behave a certain way, and it's a real struggle for them. So she's using psilocybin to heal from the trauma, especially from childhood, that she endured from having ADHD. And then the other woman that I interviewed, we were focusing more on her story in terms of recovering from anxiety, but also she uses psilocybin with her partner, and they've forged a deeper connection with each other, because psilocybin and other psychedelics as well can make you feel much more connected. So it changes your connection to people for the better, for the most part. And so her story is talking a little bit about that. But I felt like it was really important to incorporate people's stories, including my own, because I think we hear about psychedelics on the news, or we see it in a movie, and it can seem really scary. Oftentimes in movies or in fictional portrayals of psychedelic use, people are having like a bad trip or they're out of their minds, and that's not generally what is happening especially in a therapeutic journey. And so I feel like it's important to describe journeys in an accurate way, so that's what I wanted to do with the book. But not only that, to help give people more of an idea of what seems like a very abstract concept, like what does it mean to trip? And so these stories kind of help with that.
Off of that, I'm not going to make any judgments here, but some people may have experience with psychedelics, some people may not, especially some people may not have experience with actual psilocybin. So I know that each trip is somewhat different, and it depends a lot on your headspace and space you created for yourself, but maybe take someone through the physiological feelings of what it feels like to go up and down.
Yeah, I'll talk about both the physiological and what is the psychological aspects, like what's happening with your brain, the neurobiology of everything. So physically, you might have some visuals. You might see geometric patterns, and those patterns might kind of pulsate a little bit. And so what I mean by that is, like, I might look at a chair when I'm tripping, and it kind of seems to have extra dimensions to it, and it might pulsate. For example, when I was doing my journey, my deepest journey, the couch I was sitting on was kind of like pulsating a little bit, which is a little weird. It felt like it was breathing, and I'm like, couches shouldn't breathe. But other things that might occur, seeing colors very vividly. I did one of my journeys outside, and I was really seeing like the texture of the mountains and the trees, and the moss was like just an incredible green. So you have that a little bit. And your heart rate might go up a little bit. You might have a little increase in your blood pressure. These are just temporary effects, but it's because psilocybin is acting on your autonomic nervous system a little bit. And you might also experience one sense through another, which is a weird thing to say, but so you might look at my yellow jacket, and the yellow creates a taste in your mouth, which sounds weird. So it's like you're experiencing one sense through another, and I think that's called synesthesia. So that's some of the physiological effects. But psychologically, like what is happening and what is happening with the neurobiology of your brain is really fascinating. And this kind of illustrates why and how psilocybin works, especially in like a therapeutic context. So So researchers have come up with this concept to explain what psychedelics do, and I'll get to that in just a second, but just to kind of back up, psilocybin is a compound, it's called a tryptamine alkaloid, and that's present in magic mushrooms. And so psilocybin is the genus of the mushroom type, and then there are over 180 to probably close to 200 species. There's probably plenty that we haven't discovered of magic mushrooms, and sometimes those species have multiple types of strains that you might encounter. So there's a lot out there in terms of what is magic mushrooms, but what happens is that it binds to your serotonin receptors, and then that's what causes the trip effects, or the psychological effects that are occurring. So why would this be beneficial? Why does that binding to the serotonin receptor sites work, and what happens? I think this is really fascinating, and I was totally geeking out over this when I was writing chapter 3, which digs into all the neurobiology. But going back to, researchers came up with a model to kind of describe why this works for people, and the model is called the REBUS model. It stands for Relaxed Beliefs Under Psychedelics. And so the best way to explain it, they also have this analogy, which I'll get to in a second, but essentially when we're young, our brains are very flexible, or the term is called entropic, meaning we haven't really formed our pathways of beliefs about either how we feel about ourselves, or like we haven't really formed our identity when we're young. And but then those pathways of who we are, and then also how the world around us operates, those become much more rigid in adulthood. And it's extremely rigid, those pathways of beliefs are extremely rigid in certain mental health conditions. So in someone who has depression, there's evidence to show that rigidity is even stronger in adulthood. So why does it work when you're on psychedelics to sort of help with depression or trauma and things like that? Well, when in normal states of consciousness, when we're an adult, because our pathways are so rigid, you can think of the brain as almost like being like a frozen pond. It's just ice. So if you were to try to take a new belief about yourself and drop it into that frozen pond, it doesn't do anything. Think of throwing a rock on a frozen pond. It doesn't do anything, right? Maybe it causes a crack, but it doesn't really gain entry. And so when we're on psychedelics, that's where the relaxed beliefs come in. Our minds become much more flexible or entropic, almost like a childlike state again. Now you try to take a belief and drop it in, and the pond is now thawed. So it drops in. We can actually get that new belief into our brains, and it causes a ripple effect. It's a little bit lasting as well, which is great. And this increases neuroplasticity in the brain, the growth of new dendrites and synapses of our neurons and things like that. So this increased level of neuroplasticity. But what do I mean by like taking a new belief? So just to give you an example, let's say that, and I use this sort of example in the book, but so I have a group of girlfriends. We always get together, we hang out, and a few of us always have this weird feeling the next day after hanging out that we've like said something stupid, or we didn't behave appropriately or something, like, oh, they don't like me. That's this feeling that some of us have. And if you were trying to convince yourself that that's not true, it's hard to convince yourself of that in a normal state of consciousness. But when you're on a psychedelic, that new belief that you're trying to change, you're trying to tell yourself, oh, hey, you know what? These people keep inviting me back again. They must like me. I must not be a terrible person, and maybe I'm actually a good person to hang out with, right? So if you try to get that new belief in when you're in that very rigid state, like we all are now in a normal state of consciousness, at least I assume no one's on shrooms right now, but it's fine if you are. But when we are on a psychedelic, again, that we have the possibility to get new beliefs in. A few other things that kind of work. So we also have this ability to revisit traumas without all the associations of fear and things like that we normally associate with our traumas. There's something called fear extinction that happens, and then the researchers have another model or an analogy that's really great way of looking at this. So if we can think of a helioscope, it's something called the helioscope effect. A helioscope is an instrument that scientists use to look at the sun, because you're not supposed to look directly at the sun, it'll hurt you. So let's think of the sun as like a trauma, right? So we need like a special instrument to be able to look at our traumas, or we're going to get overly triggered about our traumas again. That's an abnormal state of consciousness. When you're on psilocybin, we can look at those traumas almost through this helioscope effect, where you can look at the traumas without getting burned, right? And it also allows you to reprocess traumas in a new way that can be more beneficial. So that's another example of what is happening in the brain. So when that activation of those serotonin receptors happens, it increases this level of neuroplasticity. So it's a great opportunity to incorporate behavior change. So the neuroplasticity is really prevalent during the actual journey, but then even after you're no longer on psilocybin, some of those effects remain, where you've got this increased level of flexibility in your brain. And so it's a great time after a journey to make behavior changes. So let's say you had shopping addiction or something like that, and you wanted to curb that, or you had some other type of addiction like gambling. It's a really great time to start making those behavior changes, because you probably have a better way of kind of curbing the addictions in that way. There's another thing called ego death as well in psychedelics. Has anyone ever heard of this term, ego death? Yeah, I see a few heads. Yeah, and it sounds like really scary. Like, what does that even mean? That sounds horrifying. So when we are so all of us have in our brains what's called the default mode network. And this is a network of brain regions that work together. It's not one single section. It's like a bunch of different brain regions that work together. And they concern our sense of self, involve memory, and so again, your traumas would be involved in the default mode network. And when you're on psilocybin, what happens is there's kind of like certain parts of the default mode network disconnect. This is just temporary. It's almost like when you're on psilocybin, let's just imagine before you go on psilocybin, there's a bunch of electrical plugs plugged into a wall. Let's say that then you're on psilocybin, and it's like unplugging them and plugging them all back in different outlets, right? We have certain areas of the brain that disconnect, and certain areas of the brain that normally are normally not connected connect. So this can have some really cool beneficial effects for people. And again, it's not lasting. This is just happening during your trip. But what I mean by ego death is that because the default mode network is so concerned with our sense of self, when we have some different cords unplugged and plugged in with that on psilocybin, it can change your level of understanding of who you are, just temporarily again. So I have a friend who did like a really deep dose, something called a hero dose, which would be like 5 grams or more, and he completely forgot temporarily like who he was, just temporarily for like 15 minutes or so. But that sounds horrifying, and I was really nervous about that before doing my own journey. But most people, if they're doing something like 2 grams, 3 grams, 3.5 in there, you're going to have elements of ego dissolution or ego death without like full-on ego death. And so an element of that might be you might feel less sort of concerned with your inner self, or so hyper aware of your actions or your doings, and you feel more connected to the universe at large, which is a really cool thing, or the people that you know and love. So for like example, when I was doing a journey, it was about 2 grams, I had the sensation of being connected by threads of light to everyone I know and love, and I could feel like their love that I could feel their love emanating to me, and I was sending love back. It's a very abstract concept, but we all know we typically have friends out there and family members who support us, right? But to really feel that network support, because you can really feel it, it's almost tangible when you're on psilocybin, it can have a really beneficial effect for making us feel less alone in the world, lessening depression, easing anxiety a little bit, things like that. So that's another element, and that's what I mean when I'm talking about ego death. It's less about you're so zoomed in on yourself and you become more connected to the world around you. And there's a great term in mysticism for this. It's called oceanic boundlessness. I just love the way that that's described, that connection that you feel to other people. So sorry I went on for a little while there, but wanted to go over all that.
That's exactly what this is for.
Okay.
So earlier you referenced bad trips, but in your book you don't really call them that.
Yeah.
Yeah, like, so, but you do have tips for if your trip is getting too intense.
Yeah, and that did happen to me during one of my deep journeys. So it's important to know, like obviously we hear about bad trips all the time, especially we see that happening on TV and movies and things like that. But in general, if someone is having, I call them challenging trips in the book because they're not necessarily bad. It can lead to a very good, better understanding of something. Again, inserting a new belief into your brain. So sometimes anxiety does crop up and you might have some fear. I certainly didn't like the couch breathing at all. That was unpleasant for me. And during that point in time, I started to get a lot of anxiety. And it was because essentially my brain wanted to work something out. My brain wanted to work out something that I was not ready to focus on in a normal state of consciousness. So anxiety can come up, and it did for me, but I sat with that anxiety during my journey, and I was just sort of like opening my mind to, okay, I need to just go where my brain wants to go, or what the mushroom wants to teach me. Sounds a little funny, but that's sort of true. And the mushroom's only acting on what's already in your own brain. So it might be that something that's really been bugging you comes up. And what was happening for me is that, so I'm 44, I'm almost 45, and so I'm in middle age, and my parents my mom's 81, she'll be 81 very soon, and my dad's just a few years younger. And they've had health concerns and things like that, and I do a lot of managing of their health care. And so it gives me a lot of anxiety to think about losing them one day. It's a fact of life. We all, lose our parents one day, and it's something that really weighs heavily on me, and I think of it as, or I used to think of it as, okay, they'll pass away someday, individually, and then I'll just have this unending life of grief after that. That's what it feels like, or what it did feel like to me. But when I was doing my journey on psilocybin, it was like the mushroom was trying to show me what's already in my own brain. It's showing me the difficult things I've gone through before in life and how I've made it through those things. And so it was like trying to show me that, hey, yeah, you're a resilient person. It's not going to be pleasant when they die, of course. You're going to have grief, but you have the tools to get through it. So I always try to say that psilocybin essentially teaches you the tools that you have within yourself to work on things like anxiety, depression, PTSD, all of that. But going back to talking about difficult journeys or challenging trips, there's great research out there that shows that even when people do have a challenging journey, or they just have like a difficult section of a trip, which is what happened to me, it can still be, they still report it as being in the top 5 or top 10 most meaningful, profound experiences of their lives. And I can say that that was absolutely true for me. Like, I certainly got very anxious and worried during my journey, but it was so beneficial because on that other side of that little section of anxiety that lasted maybe 10 or 15 minutes, I had just this immense sense of euphoria and peace wash over me at the realization that I am a resilient person. So I think that helps to sort of explain how a bad experience or something, if you're facing something difficult or having to revisit something difficult, it can still be really meaningful and profound. And so how do you protect yourself from having a bad experience? There's a concept in psychedelics, and some of you may have heard of this. It's called set and setting. And so what that means is you do some preparation before you go into a deeper journey. And so set stands for mindset. So what is your mindset going into a trip? So it would be important for you not to have a really busy schedule right when you're about to do a journey, because you're going to be worried about deadlines or tasks that you have to do. It's probably not a great idea to go into a journey if you're dealing with something really heavy right away. Like, so if you've just lost somebody and you're still grieving, it could be really difficult to go do a journey right then. You may want to wait a few months until the loss is not lessened, but you've had time to process it a little bit. So, I mean, psilocybin can be a great way to deal with grief, but it may not be the right time to do something right away. So your mindset is really about what's your mindset going into it, and part of that mindset should be being really open to what the mushroom working on your own brain wants to teach you. That can ease you into having a good trip. And then setting, going back to set and setting stands for, I mean, obviously, just what's your environment? Are you inside or outside? Are you around a bunch of people? Are you at a festival or in your own apartment? And there's nothing wrong with people using psilocybin recreationally. I have no problem with that. But if you are trying to work on something, or you or have an intention going into it, it might be best to do that in a more therapeutic setting, meaning that you're in your house or you're in a beautiful outdoor setting, you're with someone who's safe, perhaps somebody who's trip sitting you or guiding you would be the best way to do that, and that would help protect you from having a negative experience. It's no guarantee, it just helps set you up for the best experience possible.
Excellent. So before we get to some audience questions, what is the one thing that you try and leave folks with when you're talking about this subject?
Ooh, just one thing?
Well, you can give more than that. I just thought I'd leave it at just one and see where you go.
Yeah, I think when we talk about health, and especially women's health, so I'm going to talk about menopause just for a minute, because I think this illustrates something that's really important. So if you're going through menopause and you're dealing with a bunch of different conditions, different symptoms related to menopause, it matters. Your life history actually matters. So there's research to show that if you've had adverse childhood experiences, also called ACEs for short, like ACE and then S. And so adverse childhood experiences are things like when you were young, you were abused, you were neglected, you grew up in systemic racism or poverty, or you had a parent who was incarcerated, a parent with substance addiction, perhaps your parents got divorced and it was a messy divorce, anything like that can be, or you lived through a tornado or a hurricane or wildfires. All of that can create what are called adverse childhood experiences. And that actually, when you're young, legitimately changes your stress response, like physically changes it, how your cortisol interacts with the rest of your body. Cortisol is a stress hormone, and so there is research to show that actually changes your stress response. And so when you go through menopause, you have a heightened stress response, and if you've already got a heightened stress response from ACEs, from adverse childhood experiences, you're more likely to have worsened menopause symptoms, whether that be something like depression or having hot flashes and whatnot. And so, and again, science really supports this. And so I think it's important to remember that our life experiences matter when we are dealing with difficult things with our bodies, whether that's a mental health condition or a physical condition, or having symptoms like menopause. And so I think when we talk about psychedelics, it's exciting to think about that researchers are now looking into things like this, like how does your life experience affect you when you've had a condition? So again, people who are sexually assaulted too, and that can happen at any time in your life, that can create worse menopause symptoms. It can also create other issues that crop up physically as well. And so it just really, really, really does matter for a woman's entire life, what's happened to someone for their entire life, how they'll, what are the best things for healing them in terms of if you have menopause or something like that. The other thing that I wanted to talk about related to menopause is one of the common symptoms of menopause would be depression. And so a lot of times the minute that you go into a doctor and say, I'm having menopausal related depression, they're gonna automatically put you on a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, so an SSRI, which would be used for depression. And there's nothing wrong with SSRIs, they are very helpful medications, but, and I don't want anyone to go off their medications without, talking to their doctors first or whatever, but I always think that's really important to say. But, the thing that I think is really a really good takeaway is that selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, they blunt your mood. That's how they work. So not only do they blunt your lows, but they also blunt your highs. Well, psilocybin is something that it doesn't blunt you at all, and research shows this. It shows that it actually makes you feel more okay with your highs and your lows. And so I think it's a really great tool, or it can be a really great tool for depression. And it, again, going back to this idea of the SSRI, if you're on an SSRI, you take it regularly, you take it every day. And trying to get off of one can be very difficult. So it might be that you only need the SSRI temporarily, but if you've ever tried to wean off of an SSRI, it's very hard to do, it's uncomfortable. And with psilocybin, you don't have to take it regularly. You might just do a journey once a year and learn from your, the idea of that relaxed beliefs under psychedelics. It changes your depression response. And that can be lasting. We know that it lasts for, I think there's research that shows it can last for up to a year. So it's almost like you're one and done, right, for the year. And then you might go back and do another journey. The other thing about journeys that we didn't really talk about yet is that when, after a journey, you would do some level of integration. And integration is just kind of looking back on what happened during your experience. What insights came up? What memories did you look at? What kind of went on in your brain? And what did you learn from that? So integration can involve like journaling and writing down your experience. So right after my journey, I was just like furiously scribbling in my journal to kind of log what had gone on in my brain. Integration can also involve having a community integration circle where you sit down with other people who have had a journey and you talk about your experiences. That can be involved in integration. Or you can work with a therapist. There are psychedelic integration therapists out there who can kind of help you navigate what you learned as well. But that's a really key part of the process of healing on psilocybin, because if you just do your journey and then you don't really think about it afterwards, you're not going to have these really beneficial effects. You might have some beneficial effects, but it's really, we have to do the work too. We can't just let the mushroom do all the work, So I just wanted to bring that up as well.
I think that's a really great point. We're going to open this up to the audience for any questions they have.
Yeah, the country singer Margot Price has spoken and written about her experiences with psilocybin insofar as it relates to her alcoholism and suddenly feeling after she took her first drink that she didn't want to drink anymore. And alcoholism is notoriously difficult to treat. Is there an understanding of how that works with psilocybin to cease that craving?
Yeah, I think researchers are still sort of digging into this, but there's something with the reward system or dopamine system that happens, and so it can curb addictions. And addictions can have a situation where there's something in the brain that's a little bit more rigid. I think it might be the angular gyrus part of the brain is involved in addiction and that rigidity about addiction and things like that. And so it relaxes that to a certain extent, and that's why it also works for something like eating disorders and such. But there is research out there. I mean, what she writes about, what Margot Price writes about is very true. Research is showing that when people who do have an alcohol use disorder use psilocybin in clinical trials, it reduces the number of their heavy drinking days. And I don't have an alcohol use disorder, but I certainly like my wine. I noticed after my journey that I wasn't even reaching for the wine. At like night when you're going to have like a glass of wine with dinner to sort of unwind after working all day. I just wasn't even doing that. I wasn't even thinking about it. So it's something that happens almost to an extent almost automatically, but that happens in the brain. But researchers are still trying to understand exactly why. But it does have to do with something, the neurobiology of addiction, and then the neurobiology of what goes on during a journey. So that's a really great question.
So there are a number of substances that you can combine with psilocybin to kind of change the effect that it has on you. And I read about like stamen stacks and like L-theanine and things like that. I'm curious about your findings for women's health particularly. What are these aggregate other things that in combination can maybe mitigate some of the negative effects and then support the positive effects?
Sure, yeah. So the Stamets stack is a protocol of microdosing. It is I do write about it in the book in one of the logistics chapter. And so it involves it's a microdosing protocol. So you're taking a very small amount and you're not going to have psychedelic effects, but it can have beneficial effects. And that's what's meant by the stack is you're taking a small amount of psilocybin, you're taking a small amount of lion's mane mushroom, which is a functional mushroom. It's not psychedelic, but it does have beneficial effects on neuroplasticity of the brain, and it can increase focus and just general well-being. And then the third item is niacin, which is essentially vitamin B3, which is really crucial for every cell in our body to manage energy. And so it can help with fatigue and things like that. And we lose the level of, what happens with vitamin 3 is that it turns into an element called NAD plus in the body. And I won't get into all the science of this, but our levels of NAD plus drop dramatically by middle age. And so that's why we end up having all these sort of aging processes, or it's an element of why we age. It's why we get aching joints and can't run as fast in our 5Ks and things like that. And so these elements, Paul Stamets combined these elements as a microdosing protocol to have just general beneficial effects on the body, to increase your focus, increase your well-being, reduce pain perhaps related to like aching joints and things like that. Now, I didn't look directly at the Stamets stack with women's health, so I don't have there is just no research on that right now. I would have loved to have found some, but we just don't have that. But I could see beneficial effects for things like if you have a chronic pain condition or menstrual migraine or some type of inflammatory condition where you're using the Stamets stack to kind of curb all of that over time. Great question.
Well, real quick, off of L-theanine before we get to anything, that's the main amino in True Tea.
Yeah.
And so that's frequently used in combination with psilocybin.
It is, yeah. And so again, just offering that relaxation effect, plus, we might just have anxiety going into a journey. So using L-theanine in combination with a psychedelic for a journey could just have that beneficial effect of kind of tamping down some of that anxiety, causing a little bit of relaxation and things like that. So that's a great compound.
We have one over here first.
Yeah, I was curious, going back to the beginning, you're talking about just access, and like, as someone interested in whether macrodosing or microdosing, like how do you go about that?
Right, in terms of like deciding what to do?
Or just to find
Yeah, it's really hard, and I don't have any hard and fast answers. I always share the name of my personal guide because he's a great resource in terms of if you wanted to do a deeper journey in a therapeutic setting. His name is Gabriel Castillo. It's in the book, and the first chapter I mentioned his name, and his company is called Finally Detached. And so he's somebody I really trust because I've had an experience with him already, and you do have to be careful who you trust, and because people will take, there is nefarious stuff going on in any industry. It's also in the psychedelic industry where people are using psychedelics in nefarious ways, and then sexual assault, they perpetrate sexual assault on the people that are their clients. And so that has happened out there. And so I certainly want to make people aware. And the issue, especially with psilocybin or other psychedelics, is that you're in an incredibly vulnerable state when you're on a psychedelic because of that mind flexibility that occurs, but also you're open to being more suggestible. So someone might, convince you that you want to do something when you normally wouldn't have done that. So it's something to really be aware of, and I don't say that to scare anybody. I just want to express that that is an issue. So you want to be very careful who you work with. So that's why I only recommend my guide when I do talks, because I trust him, and he brings a female tripsitter with him who's actually his mother, so, which is fascinating. So she and I were the same, relatively close in age. She's 48, I was 44 at the time that I did my journey with him, and we hit it off, and he's 30, and so she had him at a very young age, but it was nice to have that connection with her in terms of where we were in life, and I just felt so at ease. But going back to your question, again, I can't really recommend anyone else other than him because that's the only person that I've experienced a journey with. I would recommend starting with a deeper journey, perhaps, because, and then adding microdosing after that as to sort of layer on the effects that you've already experienced with your journey. And then I would recommend journeying either every 6 months or every year, something like that. It would be a good protocol. But yeah, in terms of getting started and access, I know you don't have legalization here. I don't have it in my state of where I live in Tennessee. I'm from North Dakota though, so I'm like you're all's neighbors. But but yeah, we don't have legality there. But my guide, off the record, we just met at a cabin in the woods. We rented an Airbnb. Don't tell Airbnb or anything. I'll get banned from Airbnb. But a cabin in the woods in South Carolina. Drove about 4 hours to get there, and it was great. But he travels all over the country, so that's a useful thing.
There are some people locally who are guides that you can.
How do you
I know one advertises on NPR, so look at their list.
There are also organizations out there that women have started, which I'm really excited about. So there's Moms on Mushrooms, and so that's just like an online community headed by Tracy T. She's fabulous. But it offers a safe place for moms especially to share resources with each other. So if someone's found a good guide they want to share, they'll share that in Moms on Mushrooms. And it's also just giving parents especially a safe place to talk about their use, because there are benefits to using psilocybin while parenting, for example. So you might go off and do your solo journey, and then you come back and you're sober again, and you get down on the floor and you like playing Legos with your kid because your brain has increased neuroplasticity and a little bit of increased flexibility, and so you get back to that childlike state. But also, going back to this talking about ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, if you've had 4 or more ACEs in your life, your children are also more likely, or threefold more likely to have 4 or more ACEs. So I think that psilocybin can be used to help stop this cycle of generational trauma that is perpetuated on down, through generation after generation. If parents are, trying psilocybin and healing some of the, concerns or issues that they are having, it could boost your parenting game. So I wanted to mention Moms on Mushrooms. There's another one called Plant Parenthood that is, which I love, and that is another resource, especially for parents, but it's all parents, all genders. And there used to be an organization called Sisters in Psychedelics. It just folded, but they were going to do a big conference in Vancouver this year. And I think that the organizers just got overwhelmed with everything. But one of the organizers started another company, or I should say a nonprofit, and it's called the Flourish Academy. And so that is also a place where people are sharing resources, again, about access and guides and things like that. So it's a great question.
Has there been research done on the effects for people with different brain conditions, such as memory loss, Alzheimer's, or some of those, the spectrum?
Yeah, so that is also a really great question. The research is just getting going on that, so we don't have full-scale, phase 3 clinical trials on that, but they have looked at, so it does increase neuroplasticity, so it may be beneficial for something like Alzheimer's or even maybe Parkinson's. So they're looking into that, and clinical trials are just starting to get going. We have some research on rats. We're not rats, so that doesn't always translate to humans. But yeah, it does seem like we are going to have good research coming out about that. I don't know about the spectrum yet. I could see that as a possibility as research moves forward. It has been, so psilocybin has been researched so far. I think it's related to depression-related dementia. So depression can crop up in when someone has elements of dementia, and so it has been looked at for that, and it has been looked at for easing anxiety if you have a terminal diagnosis of something. So easing your concepts about death and essentially the end of your life. And so I'm excited about that research coming out as well. And so I do think we'll start to see a lot of new science coming out about specifically Alzheimer's and stuff.
And I actually do have an anecdotal, a number of people I know who utilized it for sundowning specifically. And it apparently helps them, but that is anecdotal. We have one more.
So I was wondering, you mentioned earlier sexual dysfunction in women, and unfortunately, I do not know what that is. I mean, so like, how would you categorize that, and then what does psilocybin do in terms of treating it?
Sure, that is a really good question. So female sexual dysfunction can mean many different things or different elements of it. There's where someone, like somebody just can't orgasm, or they have pain with intercourse, which is a common thing with endometriosis and other pelvic disorders. And then other things that could happen, so pain with intercourse, or again, difficulty orgasming or vaginal dryness, all of these things fall under the umbrella of female sexual dysfunction. It's not just one thing. But in terms of how could psilocybin help with that, researchers haven't fully studied this yet, but it does, we do have like some anecdotal reports out there about this, and I think researchers will study it, but we do know that female sexual dysfunction is more prevalent in people who've undergone sexual assault. So if we can heal trauma from that, there's potential for healing female sexual dysfunction or changing the course of that. But also, two things that are protective against female sexual dysfunction would be having a positive body image, and then also having intimate partner communication with the person that you're sleeping with. And so in terms of body image, psilocybin is being studied for eating disorders and with good results, especially for anorexia nervosa. And so it works, it does something with the angular gyrus with body image, which is, I would have to dig into my notes to reiterate the science to you. But there's an element that, or there's some science out there that is suggesting that psilocybin can help with body image, and then it also facilitates can facilitate more intimate partner communication. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you would have to do a journey with your partner and then talk about it or have sex during your journey. That's not what needs to happen. You could go off and do your own journey and then feel more connected to your partner, and then that would, even if they've never done psilocybin, and then that can help facilitate more confidence in the bedroom, or just make you feel a little bit more at ease, things like that. So again, this hasn't actually been studied yet, but these are the concepts that would relate to perhaps helping with female sexual dysfunction. So I do have a section in the book. I have a whole chapter on sex, and I go into concepts regarding consent, and then also the possibility for psilocybin to help sex lives, essentially. Great question.
Okay. Let's do two more. So
Yeah. You haven't mentioned much about LSD. How do what are the palliative differences between psilocybin and LSD in regards to what you're talking about?
Yeah, I haven't really studied and done the research on LSD, so I can't really speak to that, and I've never tried it, so I don't think that I'm the expert to answer that. In my book, it just focuses on psilocybin and all the research with that. So I apologize, I can't give you more insight. They do have different, the psychedelic effects are very similar in that this concept of the rebus model would be the same. We have relaxed beliefs on psychedelics, so it's the same thing if you're on MDMA or LSD or psilocybin. So some of those concepts are very similar. A big difference between psilocybin and LSD is that psilocybin is a natural substance, of course, and then LSD is a synthetic, something that's created synthetically. And there's not necessarily that one is more beneficial than the other, but we're not as far along on the clinical trial research on LSD as we are on psilocybin and MDMA, which is on the street called ecstasy or Molly. So we're further along on those, so I'm just not up to speed on LSD. So maybe that's my next book.
So I'm going to piggyback on her question about the spectrum. Are there any contraindications that you've come across? Because I know certain, especially schizophrenia is somewhat of a contraindication for psilocybin. Did you find anything involved in that topic of autism?
Not with autism. That wasn't listed, but I would guess. So I listed all the conditions in one of my chapters, the safety chapter, that would preclude you or mean that you could not be considered for a clinical trial. So these are things like heart conditions, if you have diabetes, things like that, and those are just sort of safety indications, and those people are generally excluded for clinical trials, but sometimes then clinical trials crop up specifically for people with a condition. So for example, you're also excluded from clinical trials if you have borderline personality disorder or a major mood disorder of some sort, and that's simply because psilocybin it can be very dysregulating, and if you already have issues with, it's just temporarily dysregulating, but if you already have issues trying to self-regulate your emotions, it could lead to a more difficult journey. And so researchers typically exclude people with personality disorders. However, they often are studying specifically a personality disorder. So right now there's a clinical trial going on for borderline personality disorder. So researchers are just trying to be really careful with that in terms of clinical trials to ensure safety and then ensure that their clinical trial results are accurate. And so if someone is highly dysregulated going into a clinical trial, that could skew results unless you're already studying this specific mood disorder. But I did not see anything specifically regarding autism in the literature that would be exclusionary. It's possible that it would be, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you could never do psilocybin if somebody has autism. It's more that, or another condition that is exclusionary for a clinical trial. It just means you would want to take a step back and think, okay, what's the safest way for me to go about doing a journey, probably with a psychedelic assisted therapist and other clinicians present to help if something really difficult or destabilizing crops up, So you can work with mental health professionals and other clinicians for that.
Okay, and I have a related question. Did you find any science on the age of users use if it's, again, contraindicated below a certain age?
I didn't necessarily find anything specific about that. I think just in general.
Can you repeat the question?
Oh, she was asking about age. Like, is there an age when people shouldn't, underneath a certain age when they shouldn't be using psychedelics? And I would say, yeah, if you're not an adult, if you're not 18, I don't recommend it, simply because your brain is still really super flexible and you may not have the regulating abilities or tools that you have in an adulthood, and simply that's because the prefrontal cortex is not quite all the way formed in young adults, and so it could be very destabilizing, or you could have a difficult trip. Now, of course, there are teenagers all over that have used psilocybin, and I was around them when I was a teenager, and so I don't know that it's necessarily like the worst thing in the world. There are certainly worse things out there for people to be doing, but I don't recommend it to people under 18.
And the other side,
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry, you're talking about like the older age? Yeah, so I think there's no limit there. It's just more thinking about, like, you know, obviously heart conditions are more prevalent in people over 65, like heart arrhythmias and then high blood pressure and things like that. And we just need to keep in mind that psilocybin does raise the heart rate a little bit, raise the blood pressure. So if somebody has underlying conditions, again, I just recommend stopping and saying, how do I do this in the safest way? It's probably not by downing a bunch of mushrooms at a festival. It would be more like, okay, I'm going to work with a mental health professional who's skilled and trained in this, and then I'm also maybe going to talk to my doctor about it. But that would be the only, you know, kind of thing that I would consider or, you know, want to make clear. Thank you.
All right, folks, thank you so much for joining us for this conversation.
Thank you, everybody.
Jennifer's available for more questions and for book signing.